I adjusted the cuffs of my emerald silk gown as the federal agents breached the heavy mahogany doors. The brass hinges groaned under the weight of the raid. Up at the podium, Diana smiled into the microphone, her diamonds catching the chandelier light. She was basking in the applause of elite society, entirely oblivious to the steel handcuffs clicking open just inches behind her back. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. I knew exactly who tipped them off. But to understand how we reached this flawless point of financial ruin, we have to rewind 6 months to a seemingly petty babysitting invoice. Before I explain how I dismantled their fraudulent empire, let me know how old you are and where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe to Sarah Told Stories if you have ever had to outsmart toxic relatives who treated your boundaries like a joke. I am Catherine Schmidt, 33 years old and a senior risk actuary for a premier commercial insurance firm in Hartford. I spend my days analyzing liability models and calculating the exact probability of catastrophic failure. I see numbers and risks where other people just see daily life. My career demands intense focus, which is why a sudden childcare cancellation on the morning of a critical boardroom presentation felt like a localized emergency. I needed someone to watch my 2-year-old son for exactly 4 hours. Against my better judgment, I drove down to the coastal town of Greenwich and knocked on the custom iron doors of my in-laws' estate. Philip and Diana projected the polished illusion of generational wealth. Their foyer smelled of fresh lilies and expensive lemon wax. Diana stood in her immaculate kitchen, tapping a manicured fingernail against the cool surface of her imported granite island. She did not reach out to hug her grandson. Instead, she slid a crisp, printed piece of paper across the stone. It stopped right next to my keys. I picked it up. It was a formal, itemized invoice. The rate listed was $125 an hour. I looked up, searching her eyes for a punchline. Her gaze was hard, her posture unnaturally rigid. "We are not free labor," Catherine Diana stated, her voice tight and clipped. "Our time is a premium commodity. You cannot just drop your child here because your little desk job ran into a scheduling issue." I stared at the printed ink. Beside her, Philip cleared his throat, adjusting the collar of his golf shirt. He avoided looking directly at me, staring intently at the espresso machine. "We just had a frustrating clerical error with a church vendor this morning," Philip muttered, almost defensively. "Cash flow is tied up. We need the hourly rate paid upfront in cash." My mind instantly shifted gears. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt incredibly thin. True wealth does not generate printed invoices for family members over a few $100s. People sitting on millions in liquid assets do not extort their own bloodline to cover a minor church vendor error. The tight set of Diana's jaw, the nervous shifting of Philip's feet, it was not arrogance staring back at me. It was raw, unadulterated panic. They were drowning and they needed untraceable cash immediately. I set the paper back onto the granite. "I will figure out another arrangement," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. I picked up my son, turned my back on their sprawling estate, and walked out the front door. They thought I was just a stubborn daughter-in-law throwing a tantrum. They had no idea they had just handed a forensic actuary the exact puzzle piece needed to unspool their entire lives. The heavy leather door of my luxury sedan shut with a solid, definitive thud, sealing me inside the quiet cabin. I took a slow, stabilizing breath as I checked the rearview mirror. My 2-year-old son was safely fastened in his car seat, oblivious to the profound tension radiating from the front seat. I shifted the car into drive and steered away from the sprawling Greenwich estate, leaving the pristine, manicured lawns and towering iron gates behind me. The gray morning sky over the Long Island Sound mirrored the cold realization settling deep in my chest. I merged onto the highway heading north toward Hartford. My hands gripped the steering wheel with practiced precision. I needed an immediate solution for my childcare crisis, but before I tackled the logistics, I needed to inform my husband about his parents' extortionate behavior. I tapped a button on the steering wheel, routing a call to Nathan through the Bluetooth audio system. The line rang 3 times before he answered. The ambient noise of his boutique investment firm echoed in the background. I heard the faint clinking of coffee cups and the hushed tones of his junior brokers. Nathan greeted me with a distracted, casual tone, asking if I had dropped our son off at his parents' house yet. I kept my voice steady and professional, stripping away any emotional fraying. I recounted the exact interaction with Diana. I detailed the printed, itemized invoice, the demand for $125 an hour, and Philip nervous pacing by the espresso machine. I expected Nathan to share my outrage. I expected him to apologize for their sheer audacity and assure me he would handle his family. Instead, a heavy, dense silence filled the car. When Nathan finally spoke, his tone was not apologetic. It was dripping with cowardly, patronizing condescension. He let out a soft, dismissive sigh. "You have to look at it from their perspective, Catherine," he said, his voice echoing through the car speakers. "My parents are highly sought-after individuals. Their time is a premium commodity. They are just trying to teach us a valuable lesson in boundaries. You cannot just demand free labor from people of their social standing." I stared at the highway ahead, the lanes blurring into a solid gray ribbon. A lesson in boundaries. The phrase felt like a physical weight pressing against my ribs. I asked him if he genuinely believed charging his own wife an exorbitant hourly rate to watch their only grandchild for a single afternoon was a normal familial boundary. Nathan did not hesitate. He doubled down on his spineless defense. He suggested that I simply write them a check from my corporate expense account to smooth things over. He told me to treat them like a premium vendor, so everyone could walk away satisfied. In that fleeting space between his words, the entire illusion of my marriage fractured into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The man on the other end of the line was not a supportive partner. He was a parasitic extension of his parents' toxic ecosystem. He was prioritizing their fragile egos and endless greed over the stability of his own wife and child. But Nathan was not finished. Uncomfortable with my prolonged silence, he kept talking, attempting to justify his capitulation. He wanted to make their desperate cash grab sound like a sophisticated business maneuver. "You have to understand they are dealing with a lot of liquid transitions right now," Nathan continued, his tone adopting a faux authoritative edge. "My own firm is actually pretty cash poor at the moment because Dad is rapidly moving assets around. He is restructuring some significant holdings for a new community project at their church. Things are just tight across the board, so they need immediate compensation for their time. Just pay the invoice, Catherine. It is not worth the friction." My actuarial mind isolated that specific sentence, instantly severing it from the rest of his pathetic rambling. He said his boutique firm was cash poor because his father was rapidly moving assets around. That single phrase was a terrifying piece of financial foreshadowing. A legitimate independent investment firm does not experience sudden liquidity crises simply because the founder-father is restructuring personal assets for a church project. That scenario only occurs in one very specific environment. It happens when corporate funds and personal family wealth are deeply and dangerously commingled. I did not scream at him. I did not demand further explanation or threaten a divorce over the phone. A panicked response would only alert him to my shifting perspective. I simply told him I had to focus on driving and ended the call. The silence returned to the cabin, but the parameters of my reality were now undeniably altered. I stopped viewing Nathan as my husband. I began analyzing him through the cold, unyielding lens of my profession. He was no longer a spouse. He was a severe financial liability tethered directly to my own hard-earned wealth. If he was willing to sacrifice my career to appease his parents' sudden desperation for untraceable cash, I had to pivot instantly to pure self-preservation. I reached the corporate headquarters of my insurance firm with exactly 45 minutes to spare before my critical presentation. I bypassed the standard parking garage and utilized my executive clearance to access the private underground tier. I carried my son straight to the emergency corporate daycare center, a premium perk reserved strictly for senior directors facing unforeseen scheduling disasters. I signed the authorization forms, kissed his forehead, and took the elevator up to the boardroom. I walked into the glass-walled conference room wearing a tailored charcoal suit, projecting an aura of total invincibility. For the next 2 hours, I stood before a table of seasoned insurance executives and flawlessly delivered complex risk assessment models. I outlined probability curves, liability thresholds, and strategic containment protocols. I controlled the room with effortless precision, securing a crucial initiative that effectively saved my current trajectory at the firm. The adrenaline of undeniable professional success hummed in my veins, but beneath it lay a glacial layer of resolve. I was standing in a room full of people paying me to calculate the exact cost of a disaster, while the greatest disaster of my life was waiting for me at home. That evening, the Connecticut townhouse felt hollow. Nathan returned from his office projecting his usual oblivious charm, entirely convinced that his earlier phone call had successfully managed my expectations. He poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon and retreated to the living room to watch a sports broadcast, acting as though our morning conflict had never occurred. I played the role of the calm, unaffected wife. I prepared dinner, bathed our son, and put him to bed with gentle, soothing routines. The moment the house grew quiet, I walked into my home office and locked the door behind me. I opened my encrypted desktop terminal and initiated a silent, localized audit of every joint financial account tied to our marriage. I bypassed the standard dashboard summaries and dug directly into the raw routing histories. I scrutinized our shared savings, our checking reserves, and the escrow accounts tied to our properties. The preliminary data revealed a disturbing pattern of minor, uncharacteristic withdrawals over the past several months. Small sums of money transferring from our joint reserves into Nathan external accounts without any corresponding invoices or recognizable vendor names. The financial bleed was subtle, but the trajectory was clear. He was funneling capital out of our household. I closed the banking portal and my jaw setting into a rigid line. My in-laws were desperate for cash, my husband firm was mysteriously illiquid, and my own household reserves were being quietly siphoned. The toxic syndicate was closing in around me, and I refused to be their collateral damage. To sever these treacherous ties and protect my career from future sabotage, I needed to establish an impenetrable firewall. The very first step was securing an independent, permanent childcare solution. I needed someone entirely outside of their affluent, corrupt social circle. I needed a professional who answered only to me, ensuring Philip and Diana could never use my son as leverage again. I opened a secure community board on my computer, preparing to hunt for the perfect candidate, entirely unaware that my search was about to bring the perfect weapon directly to my front door. The morning sun cast long, sharp angles across my home office as I filtered through candidate profiles on an encrypted local childcare network. I refused to ever rely on my toxic in-laws again. The mere thought of subjecting my son to Diana and her transactional affection made my stomach churn. I needed a permanent, high-quality solution. I needed someone entirely insulated from the country club gossip rings and the affluent sycophants who orbited my husband family. I approached the hiring process with the exact same ruthless precision I applied to underwriting corporate risk policies. Every resume was cross-referenced, every reference was vetted. I discarded dozens of applicants who showed even a hint of connection to the Greenwich elite. By Thursday afternoon, I scheduled an in-person interview with a 28-year-old woman named Hannah. She arrived at my townhouse exactly 5 minutes early. Hannah did not wear flashy designer labels or project the chaotic energy of someone trying too hard to impress. She wore a tailored navy blazer, her dark hair pulled back into a neat professional clasp. She sat across from me in my living room, handing over a pristine, meticulously organized portfolio of certifications and background clearances. Her demeanor was quiet, but her eyes tracked the room with a sharp, intelligent focus. I poured us both a cup of black coffee, observing her steady hands. She answered my initial questions flawlessly, detailing her background in early childhood development and her CPR training. She was the perfect candidate on paper. However, my actuarial instincts always require a deep dive into employment gaps. I noted a sudden shift in her timeline. Hannah had a stellar employment record, but there was an abrupt departure from her previous position just 3 months prior. I set my coffee cup down on the glass table, leaning forward slightly. I asked her directly about the gap. I told her I required total transparency if she was going to be entrusted with my child. Hannah looked down at her hands for a fleeting second. The hesitation was barely perceptible, but it was there. When she raised her gaze back to meet mine, I saw a flash of raw, lingering frustration. She took a slow breath and explained that her previous role was not in childcare. For the past 2 years, she had served as the charity treasurer for Grace Coastal Fellowship. It was an elite historic congregation nestled in the wealthiest zip code of the state. It was the exact same church where Philip and Diana proudly dominated the front pews and controlled the primary benefactor committees. The air in my living room grew instantly still. I kept my face an unreadable mask, hiding the sudden jolt of adrenaline spiking through my veins. I asked her why she left such a prestigious administrative position. Hannah straightened her spine and her voice steadying into a factual, clinical tone. She clarified that she did not leave voluntarily. She was abruptly ousted by the head of the financial committee. She was fired by Diana. My pulse drummed a steady rhythmic beat against my temples. I asked Hannah to explain the exact circumstances of her termination. I needed the raw data. Hannah explained that overseeing the charitable treasury meant she personally authorized every outbound vendor payment. 3 months ago, Diana bypassed standard protocol and presented a direct invoice demanding immediate payment from the primary building fund. The invoice was for $50,000. It was categorized under premium commercial landscaping and structural soil grading. Hannah paused, her eyes narrowing as she recalled the event. She told me she refused to sign the authorization. She refused because she cross-referenced the property address listed on the vendor invoice with the municipal zoning records. The $50,000 landscaping bill was for a church property that literally did not exist. It was a phantom address, a fabricated parcel of land. When Hannah confronted Diana, pointing out the glaring discrepancy, my mother-in-law did not offer a logical explanation. Instead, Diana orchestrated a swift, ruthless boardroom coup. She accused Hannah of clerical incompetence, revoked her security access, and had her escorted off the church grounds by the end of the week. Listening to Hannah speak, a vivid memory washed over me, pulling me back to my childhood dining room. I was 12 years old, sitting across from my father at our scratched wooden kitchen table. The scent of black coffee and fresh newsprint filled the air. My father was a seasoned forensic auditor. He had spread a dozen complex ledger sheets across the table, handing me a red pen. He taught me how to read risk assessment spreadsheets that night. He pointed to a column of numbers, his voice low and serious. He told me that people will always lie to protect their egos or their secrets, but the math never lies. He taught me how to spot phantom expenses, how to trace the invisible threads of fabricated vendors, and how to identify the exact moment a desperate person tries to balance a rotting book. He instilled the exact forensic skills I now possessed. The memory faded, snapping me back to the present reality of my living room. The puzzle pieces crashed together with breathtaking clarity. Diana was not just an arrogant socialite charging me an extortionate rate for babysitting. She was actively bleeding her own congregation dry. The fake $50,000 invoice was a textbook extraction method. My in-laws were using the church building fund as their personal piggy bank. I looked at Hannah sitting across from me. I had not just hired a reliable nanny. I had inadvertently recruited a high-level inside witness to a sprawling financial crime. Hannah possessed intimate institutional knowledge of the specific ledgers, the vendor names, and the exact dates of the fraudulent transactions. She held the master key to the opaque operations Philip and Diana thought they had successfully buried. I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. I saw the residual sting of her wrongful termination, the deep injustice of being crushed by a wealthy tyrant. I asked Hannah if she was ready to go back to work. I offered her the childcare position immediately, but I also offered her something infinitely more valuable. I offered her the unspoken promise of undeniable retribution. Hannah accepted the job without a single moment of hesitation. We did not need to explicitly outline a detailed conspiracy. The silent, mutually beneficial alliance was forged in the quiet understanding that we both held a piece of the weapon required to detonate Diana's pristine social facade. Hannah would care for my son, ensuring he was entirely protected from the toxic influence of my husband family. In exchange, her presence in my household would serve as the ultimate psychological trigger. I stood up and extended my hand. Hannah shook it, her grip firm and resolute. I instructed her to begin on Sunday morning. I told her we would not be spending the weekend hiding in the townhouse. Instead, we were going to make a highly visible public debut. I planned to attend the upcoming Sunday service at Grace Coastal Fellowship. I wanted Nathan there. I wanted my son there. And most importantly, I wanted Hannah standing directly by my side in her official capacity as my employee. I walked to the front window, watching Hannah drive away down the tree-lined street. The financial war had officially shifted from a defensive posture into a targeted offensive strike. Philip and Diana believed they had insulated their crimes by isolating the people who knew too much. They thought firing the treasurer erased the threat. They were about to learn that burying a problem only ensures it takes root and grows. Sunday morning was approaching fast. I pictured Diana standing in her designer silk, holding court in the grand vestibule, basking in the admiration of her wealthy peers. I could almost taste the impending panic. She thought she was untouchable, but she was about to turn around and lock eyes with the very ghost she tried to erase. The sanctuary of her elite church was about to become the drop zone for a devastating psychological ambush. The architecture of Grace Coastal Fellowship projected an aura of impenetrable old money. Soaring vaulted ceilings crafted from imported mahogany trapped the echoes of whispered networking deals masquerading as Sunday morning worship. I stepped out of our SUV into the crisp Connecticut air, smoothing the skirt of my tailored slate dress. Nathan walked a few paces ahead, already adjusting his tie, his posture rigid with the ingrained anxiety of a son trained to constantly seek his parents' approval. Right beside me walked Hannah. She wore a modest charcoal blazer, projecting calm professionalism as she carried my 2-year-old son on her hip. My toddler rested his head against her shoulder, instantly comfortable in her care. The battleground was set. We ascended the wide stone steps and pushed through the heavy brass doors into the grand vestibule. The vestibule was a staging ground for the Greenwich elite. Women draped in bespoke silk and men wearing custom-tailored wool exchanged polite pleasantries while silently calculating each other's net worth. In the very center of the room stood Diana. She was adorned in a pristine ivory sheath dress, holding a leather-bound program, functioning as the undisputed matriarch of the congregation. She laughed, a high musical sound, patting the arm of a prominent local judge. I paused near the entrance, allowing the visual geometry of the room to naturally draw her attention toward our arrival. I wanted her to see us before we even took a single step toward the sanctuary. Diana turned her head ready to bestow a condescending greeting upon her son. Her gaze landed on Nathan, then shifted to me, and finally settled on the young woman standing right by my side. The transformation was instantaneous and breathtaking to witness. The rosy flush of aristocratic confidence vanished from Diana's cheeks, leaving her complexion a sickening chalky gray. Her musical laugh died in her throat, replaced by a sharp intake of breath. The leather-bound program slipped from her grip, hitting the polished marble floor with a dull thud. To the surrounding wealthy parishioners, Hannah was merely a local caregiver hired to manage a toddler. But Diana knew the truth. Diana was staring directly at the ousted charity treasurer, the very woman she had banished to conceal a fabricated landscaping invoice. Diana did not greet her grandson. She excused herself from the judge with a fractured, trembling smile and marched fiercely toward us. Her heels clicked a frantic, uneven rhythm against the marble. Without a word of greeting, she grabbed my elbow, her manicured nails digging painfully into my sleeve. She pulled me hard toward a secluded stone alcove near the baptismal font, desperate to isolate the threat from the prying eyes of the congregation. "What on earth do you think you are doing?" Diana hissed, her voice vibrating with an unpolished, frantic intensity. She kept her back to the open room, attempting to shield her panic from her wealthy peers. "Why is that girl holding my grandson? You need to send her away this instant." I maintained my posture, meeting her wild eyes with a cool, unblinking stare. I told her I had hired a highly recommended professional to manage our childcare needs, since her own schedule was far too premium to accommodate family. Diana's jaw clenched, her breathing shallow and erratic. "She is a disgruntled, unstable former employee," she sputtered, her chest heaving under the ivory silk. "She was terminated from the financial committee for gross incompetence. She is a profound security risk, Catherine. Fire her immediately, or I will involve the church security detail to have her escorted off the premises for trespassing." I smiled a tight, terrifyingly polite expression. "Hannah is here as my personal guest and my contracted employee," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. "Her background check was immaculate. Whatever clerical disagreements you had with her do not concern my household. She stays." I turned on my heel, leaving Diana vibrating with suppressed fury in the alcove, and walked back to my family. The sanctuary doors opened, signaling the start of the service. We took our seats in the third row, a prime location historically reserved for my in-laws. Diana and Philip slid into the pew directly behind us. The proximity was deliberate. As the choir began their opening hymn, Diana immediately initiated her counteroffensive. She leaned across the polished wooden pew, whispering venomous warnings to a group of elderly, influential board members seated nearby. She cast nervous, pointed glances at Hannah, murmuring about bringing toxic liabilities into their sacred space. She attempted a swift micro-smear campaign, labeling my new nanny as a dangerous, vindictive outsider aiming to disrupt their peaceful community. I did not allow the gossip to fester in the shadows. I waited for a lull in the music, turning around to face the prominent women Diana was attempting to poison. I pitched my voice slightly louder than a whisper, ensuring it carried across the surrounding rows. "We are just so incredibly blessed to have Hannah with us," I announced, offering the board members a radiant, unwavering smile. Her profound dedication to community service and her flawless administrative background make her an unparalleled asset to our family. It is truly wonderful to see the church nurturing such exceptional talent. The older women murmured their polite agreement, nodding warmly at Hannah, who offered a demure, respectful smile in return. Diana's covert smear campaign hit a solid brick wall of forced high society politeness. She could not openly argue without looking like an unhinged bully in the middle of a Sunday service. She sank back into her seat, her knuckles turning white as she gripped a hymnal. Throughout the entire silent war, Nathan proved his utter uselessness. He shrank into the plush cushions of the pew, staring intently at the stained glass windows, desperately pretending the escalating friction did not exist. Nathan had been conditioned since birth to avoid challenging his mother's social reign. He preferred to let me endure her hostility, rather than risk losing his comfortable position in the family hierarchy. He offered no defense of my choices, no reprimand for his mother behavior, just a hollow, cowardly silence. His inaction solidified my resolve. He was a spineless obstacle I would eventually need to excise from my life entirely. As the sermon commenced, I sat forward analyzing the raw data of the morning interactions. Diana's reaction was far beyond standard aristocratic snobbery. An innocent woman does not drop her program and lose the color in her face over a simple staffing dispute. The sheer, unfiltered terror radiating from my mother-in-law confirmed my darkest, most calculating suspicions. The fabricated invoice was not an isolated accounting error. There was a staggering financial leak draining the church treasury, and Diana was actively shielding a live crime scene. She was profoundly terrified that the woman she tried to bury would inevitably point me toward the missing ledger. The service concluded, and as we exited the sanctuary, Diana shot me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She realized she could not intimidate me through mere social pressure or whispered rumors. If she wanted to force my compliance and eliminate the threat Hannah posed, she would have to utilize a much heavier weapon. By Tuesday morning, Diana would bypass the social games entirely and launch a brutal, direct strike aimed straight at the financial heart of my family, setting off a chain reaction that would force me to uncover the exact federal crime she was so desperate to hide. The retaliation arrived precisely 48 hours after our silent standoff in the church vestibule. It did not come in the form of an angry phone call or a passive-aggressive text message. Diana preferred weapons that carried official, institutional weight. On Tuesday morning, a bonded courier knocked on the front door of our Connecticut townhouse, requiring my direct signature for a thick manila envelope. I signed the electronic pad, thanking the courier, and carried the heavy parchment to the kitchen island. The return address bore the embossed silver logo of a prestigious wealth management firm located in downtown Greenwich. I broke the wax seal and slid the documents onto the granite counter. The primary page was a formal, legally binding notification regarding the educational trust fund established for my 2-year-old son. When the boy was born, Philip and Diana had hosted an opulent catered christening party, utilizing the event to publicly unveil a $250,000 trust in his name. It was a grandiose theatrical display of old money philanthropy designed entirely to secure the admiration of their country club peers. Diana retained primary trustee status, while my husband Nathan was designated as the secondary co-trustee. The document staring back at me was not a routine statement. It was a unilateral administrative freeze. I read through the dense, convoluted legalese, tracing the ink with my index finger. Diana had locked the entire $250,000 account, prohibiting any future disbursements or structural adjustments. The justification attached to the freeze was a masterpiece of aristocratic manipulation. The letter explicitly cited erratic household management and the sudden introduction of a verified security risk to the primary beneficiary. She was leveraging her financial authority to mandate a behavioral review of my parenting choices. It was a blatant high-stakes hostage situation. Diana was using my child's future as a blunt instrument to starve me into submission, forcing me to fire Hannah and bow to her authority. Footsteps sounded on the hardwood stairs. Nathan walked into the kitchen wearing a tailored navy suit, preparing for another day at his failing boutique investment firm. He stopped near the espresso machine, his eyes darting toward the legal documents spread across the counter. He did not ask what arrived in the mail. He already knew. His shoulders carried a rigid, defensive posture, and he deliberately avoided making eye contact with me. Your mother froze the trust I stated, my voice maintaining a flat, clinical equilibrium. I did not yell, I merely presented the data. Nathan poured his coffee in his hand, trembling just enough to make the ceramic mug clink softly against the saucer. He kept his gaze fixed on the dark liquid swirling inside the cup. "It is a standard protective measure, Catherine," he muttered, his tone laced with a cowardly rehearsed cadence. "She is the primary guarantor. You provoked her on Sunday. You brought a disgraced former church employee into her sacred space and paraded her around the congregation. Diana is just protecting the family assets from potential liabilities." I leaned against the island, studying the man I had married. I asked him how his signature appeared on the authorization line of the freeze. As a co-trustee, Diana could not execute a complete administrative lockdown without his secondary approval. Nathan finally looked up, his face pale and slick with a sudden sheen of nervous sweat. He set the coffee mug down, stepping backward as if my physical proximity burned him. "I had to sign it," he defended, his voice elevating into a frantic pitch. "You do not understand the pressure they apply. My firm is relying on a critical capital injection from my father next quarter. If I refuse to sign the freeze authorization, Diana threatened to cut off my own disbursements. I am trying to keep a business afloat. You need to stop being so stubborn and look at the bigger picture." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the short distance between the refrigerator and the sink. "Just fire the nanny, Catherine. Let her go today, and write the check for that babysitting invoice. Give them the hourly rate they asked for. Consider it a peace offering to smooth things over. We cannot afford a prolonged war with my parents over a minor staffing dispute." The air in the kitchen grew incredibly thin. The final decaying thread tethering me to this marriage severed with a clean, undeniable snap. My husband was not a partner standing shoulder to shoulder with me against an external threat. He was a deeply compromised operative prioritizing his fragile inheritance over his own child. He was willing to financially amputate his own son just to appease the fragile ego of his mother. He expected me to write a ransom check and sacrifice an innocent woman to secure his unearned allowance. I did not let my profound revulsion show. An actuary understands that displaying emotion to a hostile counterpart only provides them with leverage. I needed Nathan to believe he had won. I needed him to feel secure in his cowardice so he would drop his guard. I lowered my gaze, adopting a deliberate posture of exhausted defeat. I let out a long, trembling sigh, pretending his yelling had finally broken my spirit. I told him I would think about his demands and handle the situation quietly. A wave of palpable relief washed over Nathan's features. He adjusted his silk tie, his chest puffing out with unearned patriarchal triumph. He kissed my cheek, oblivious to the fact that my skin was practically crawling, and walked out the front door to head to his office. He genuinely believed he had successfully managed a stubborn wife. The moment the lock clicked shut, I returned my attention to the legal documents. Diana thought freezing an account was the ultimate display of dominance. She assumed the financial sector operated like a private country club, where wealth dictated invulnerability. She fundamentally misunderstood my profession. I am a senior risk actuary. I spend 50 hours a week modeling systemic failures, tracing liability chains, and exploiting microscopic loopholes in multi-billion-dollar contracts. To a socialite, a frozen account is an impenetrable vault. To an actuary, a frozen account is a glaring, glowing beacon. I gathered the paperwork, placed it into my leather briefcase, and drove directly to my corporate insurance firm in downtown Hartford. I bypassed my standard morning meetings and locked myself inside my glass-walled office. I booted up my dual-monitor encrypted terminal. Diana failed to comprehend the legal mechanics of the trap she had just triggered. Altering the operational status of a protected trust fund does not create an invisible shield. It generates a heavily monitored federal compliance event. By weaponizing the account against the primary beneficiary, she had unwittingly dragged the entire financial vehicle out of the shadows and directly into my jurisdiction. I logged into the internal fraud division portal of my premier insurance firm. Our company underwrote the specific holding bank where Diana parked the trust funds. This provided me with a highly classified tier of institutional access. I did not use my credentials to simply peek at the balance. I initiated a formal, high-priority corporate protocol. Utilizing my legal standing as the biological mother of the beneficiary and the lawful spouse of the co-trustee, I filed an official declaration of suspected identity theft and unauthorized fiduciary manipulation. This classification is the ultimate golden ticket in the financial sector. When a legal guardian claims potential illicit tampering against a minor trust, the holding institution is immediately stripped of its standard privacy cloaking privileges. The bank is legally compelled by federal mandate to cooperate with the investigating insurance body. They cannot hide behind boutique wealth managers or exclusive client privilege. I finalized the fraud alert and hit submit. The action bypassed Diana entirely. She would not receive a notification. Nathan would not receive a warning text. The system operated in the sterile, silent background of corporate compliance. By flagging the account, I triggered an automated institutional subpoena. I formally requested the comprehensive historical routing logs, the origin deposit ledgers, and the federal tax dispersion forms associated with the trust since its inception 2 years ago. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, watching a secure loading bar appear on my secondary monitor. Diana thought she was starving me into submission, playing a sophisticated game of financial chess. She had no idea she had just handed her opponent the exact combination to the safe. The holding bank servers began authenticating my institutional subpoena. The raw data started flowing through the encrypted pipeline, slowly populating my screen with row after row of highly guarded financial secrets. The numbers were preparing to tell a story that polite society had desperately tried to bury. I ordered a black coffee from the executive kitchen and rolled up my sleeves. The sun was shining over the Hartford skyline, but I was preparing for a very long, dark night of forensic auditing. The illusion of the wealthy pious-in-laws was about to meet the cold, unyielding blade of mathematics. The glowing blue light of my dual monitors cut through the deep darkness of my home office. Outside the thick glass windows, the quiet Connecticut suburbs slept soundly under a blanket of cold night air. Down the hall, I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of Nathan snoring. My husband rested peacefully in his ignorance, genuinely believing his cowardly compliance had secured his inheritance. He thought he had successfully neutralized me. He slept while I sharpened the blade that would sever his family legacy from our lives forever. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, watching the progress bar on my secure corporate portal tick toward completion. The holding bank had processed my institutional subpoena. Due to the high-priority fraud alert I initiated through my insurance firm, the bank compliance division bypassed standard customer notification protocols. Diana would not receive a courtesy email warning her that a forensic lens was shifting over her prized accounts. The data pipeline opened, and raw, unredacted financial ledgers began streaming directly into my encrypted terminal. My profession dictates that numbers tell a narrative far more honest than any human being ever could. Actuaries are trained to hunt for anomalies within vast oceans of data. We search for the invisible fault lines where risk accumulates and structures inevitably fracture. When I opened the primary directory for my 2-year-old son educational trust fund, I expected to find a standard conservative wealth management portfolio. A legitimate college trust typically features a predictable architecture. It should contain low-yield municipal bonds, diverse mutual funds, and steady quarterly dividends designed to mature safely over 2 decades. The documents staring back at me did not resemble a conservative investment strategy. They resembled a chaotic, high-velocity funnel. I pulled up the deposit histories for the past 24 months. Instead of standard monthly contributions from a legitimate family checking account, the trust was receiving erratic, staggering cash injections. $40,000 here, $65,000 there. The deposits arrived at random intervals, often clearing the bank on random Tuesday afternoons or late Friday evenings. The funds were not staying within the trust either. Almost as quickly as the cash arrived, large portions were being routed back out into a secondary holding tier, leaving just enough capital to maintain the illusion of a robust college fund. I leaned closer to the screen, tracing the origin routing numbers of these sweeping deposits. The money was not coming from Philip and Diana personal estate accounts. The influx originated from an external corporate entity listed simply as Coastal Heritage Holdings, LLC. I opened a fresh spreadsheet, my fingers flying across the quiet mechanical keyboard. I needed to isolate the exact source of this phantom company. I pulled the discreet notes Hannah had carefully provided me during our initial interview. She had memorized the specific dates and figures associated with her wrongful termination from the Church Financial Committee. I aligned her handwritten dates with the bank transfer logs displayed on my left monitor. The synchronization was flawless. 3 months ago, Diana had bypassed the charity treasury protocol to demand immediate payment for a $50,000 landscaping invoice tied to a fabricated church property. Hannah refused to sign it, resulting in her swift banishment. I cross-referenced the date of that specific confrontation. Exactly 48 hours after Diana fired Hannah, a wire transfer for precisely $50,000 cleared the church building fund. It routed directly into Coastal Heritage Holdings, LLC. 24 hours after that, the exact same sum dropped neatly into my toddler trust account. A cold, sickening realization settled deep into my bones. The picture-perfect, affluent grandparents who handed out unsolicited parenting advice at country club dinners were not generous benefactors. They were utilizing their own flesh and blood as an offshore tax haven. The sheer audacity of the scheme was breathtaking. Philip and Diana were systematically siphoning tens of thousands of dollars from the charitable donations given by their wealthy, faithful parishioners. To evade federal tax scrutiny and mask the embezzlement, they ran the stolen capital through a maze of shell companies. But every money laundering operation needs a clean, final resting place. By parking the illicit funds inside a minor educational trust, they effectively shielded the stolen money under the guise of generational wealth transfer. The IRS rarely scrutinizes grandparent gifts to a toddler college fund unless a specific red flag is raised. They were literally cannibalizing their grandson's future, turning his legal identity into a receptacle for felony wire fraud. This revelation fundamentally answered the lingering paradox that had ignited this entire war. It explained the pathetic $125 babysitting invoice. Philip and Diana were projecting an illusion of limitless wealth, but their legitimate liquid cash was entirely dried up. They lived in a sprawling Greenwich estate, drove imported luxury vehicles, and hosted lavish parties, but their actual checking accounts were likely running on fumes. They were asset-rich and incredibly cash-poor, tethered to the stolen church funds to maintain their aristocratic facade. When they demanded an hourly rate to watch my son, it was not merely an arrogant power play to diminish my career. They were genuinely desperate for clean, untraceable pocket money to cover up their immediate household deficits. I spent the next 6 hours meticulously building a master spreadsheet. I operated with the chilling clinical precision of a surgeon excising a tumor. I mapped every single erratic deposit, matching it with the corresponding shell company routing digits. I highlighted the date Hannah was ousted, drawing a thick, undeniable red line connecting her termination to the sudden spike in illicit transfers. I color-coded the liability chain, linking the church building fund directly to the holding bank and finally to the signature lines where Diana had proudly signed her name as the primary trustee. By the time the first pale rays of dawn began to creep over the Connecticut hills, the scope of my investigation had evolved. This was no longer a petty familial dispute over boundaries or childcare. It was not a simple marital disagreement. I had just assembled a comprehensive trial-ready dossier detailing a multi-million-dollar federal syndicate. I saved the encrypted files onto a secure external drive and locked it inside my briefcase. I stood up from my desk, my muscles stiff, but my mind operating with lethal clarity. I walked into my son's nursery. He was sleeping soundly, his small chest rising and falling in the quiet room. I smoothed the blanket over his shoulders, making a silent vow. The people who attempted to use his name to shield their crimes would never be allowed near him again. I showered dressed in a razor-sharp charcoal suit and drove directly to my corporate insurance headquarters in downtown Hartford. I needed to leverage my firm institutional authority to prepare the next phase of the trap. But moving massive amounts of restricted data leaves a digital footprint. Even with my advanced fraud clearance, pulling a hard subpoena on the holding bank would eventually generate an automated compliance receipt. Diana would not receive an alert, but Philip, who prided himself on micromanaging their remaining legitimate investments, monitored their overarching portfolio dashboards. I knew it was only a matter of time before he noticed the digital lock on the trust account had been overridden by a superior corporate entity. I anticipated a frantic phone call or an angry legal threat sent through their expensive attorneys. I prepared myself to deflect a barrage of digital intimidation. What I did not anticipate was how rapidly their aristocratic composure would completely unravel when backed into a corner. As I swiped my security badge and walked onto the executive floor of my firm, I assumed I had a narrow window of quiet preparation. I walked toward my glass-walled office, carrying the briefcase that held their total ruin. I failed to realize that desperate men do not send emails when their freedom is on the line. They lash out in person, hoping physical proximity will restore the power dynamic they are so accustomed to wielding. My morning was about to pivot from silent data analysis into a volatile face-to-face confrontation inside the very building where I held the ultimate home court advantage. The executive floor of my Hartford Insurance headquarters operates with the sterile precision of a surgical ward. Access requires biometric clearance and an encrypted proximity badge, ensuring the space remains insulated from the unpredictable chaos of the outside world. As I stepped out of the private elevator that Thursday morning, carrying my leather briefcase, the sleek glass walls of the corridor reflected a pristine environment built on strict compliance and unwavering protocol. The ambient air smelled faintly of ozone and expensive espresso. I walked toward my corner suite, anticipating a quiet morning of transferring my encrypted dossiers onto the corporate mainframe. I expected a digital counterattack from my in-laws' high-priced attorneys. I never anticipated a physical breach. Through the transparent partitions of my office, I spotted a figure standing behind my custom mahogany desk. The man was leaning heavily over my workstation, his fingers jabbing frantically at my locked keyboard. He wore a bespoke tweed suit, a hallmark of the Greenwich Country Club elite, but the usual tailored elegance was ruined by dark patches of sweat staining his pristine white collar. It was Philip. My father-in-law had somehow bypassed the ground floor security, presumably by flashing his platinum status identification and bullying a junior receptionist into granting him an unescorted visitor pass. Old money entitlement breeds a very specific type of delusion, where individuals genuinely believe corporate firewalls will simply bow to their prestigious lineage. I did not shout for building security. I placed my coffee cup on a nearby credenza and pushed open my office door. The quiet click of the latch echoed in the tense space. Philip jumped, his head snapping toward me. His aristocratic composure was entirely shattered. His face carried a sickly pale hue, his eyes wide with raw, unfiltered terror. The screensaver on my monitor displayed a bright red biometric lockout warning. He was attempting to erase the routing logs I had subpoenaed the night before. "What a fascinating choice of venue for a family reunion," Philip, I stated, keeping my tone flat and unyielding. "You are trespassing in a highly restricted corporate sector. My terminal logs every single failed access attempt." He abandoned the keyboard and rounded the desk, closing the distance between us. He puffed out his chest, attempting to physically intimidate me with his height. "This is a private family matter, Catherine," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound fear and fury. "You have no right poking around in our personal trusts. You initiated an institutional freeze override. You are meddling in affairs far beyond your comprehension. Cancel the inquiry right now." I stood my ground, holding my briefcase tightly against my side. A legitimate wealth manager does not break into a corporate insurance building to hide an audit, Philip. The routing numbers do not lie. I know about Coastal Heritage Holdings. I know you are filtering church donations through your grandson educational fund. The color drained further from his face, but his narcissistic pride refused to let him retreat. He slapped his palm hard against the surface of my desk, rattling the heavy glass paperweight resting near my monitor. He leaned over me, radiating stale cologne and desperation. "You are just a simple number cruncher," he sneered, trying to regain his patriarchal dominance. "You married into our legacy. You owe us your loyalty. If you do not drop this absurd witch hunt immediately, I will call the managing directors of this firm. I play golf with men who own this entire city. I will have your actuary license permanently revoked. I will ensure you never work in the financial sector again. You will return to being a quiet, grateful daughter-in-law, or I will personally destroy your career." He thought threats of social ruin would force my compliance. He fundamentally failed to realize he was standing inside my fortress. I shifted my weight slightly, reaching my left hand out to rest on the edge of my keyboard. My index finger seamlessly pressed the designated hotkey for the internal dictation software. The silent recording application initiated running invisibly in the background. I needed him to dig his own grave, and the easiest way to manipulate an arrogant man is to challenge his intellect. "You cannot destroy my career over a shell company," Philip, I replied, injecting a subtle layer of feigned uncertainty into my voice. "Coastal Heritage is just a holding pen. You cannot possibly control the outbound disbursement vectors without leaving a distinct paper trail. The church board will notice the missing capital eventually. You are not smart enough to sustain a ledger deficit of that vast magnitude." His ego flared exactly as I calculated. He could not stand being called incompetent by a woman he viewed as a subservient accessory to his family. "I control every single vector," he spat, his face turning a dark, angry crimson. "I structured the offshore routing. I established the limited liability documentation. The board will never see a single discrepancy because I hold the exclusive signatory rights to the entire building fund. You think tracing a few deposited checks gives you power over us? I own the architecture of the trust, Catherine. You are entirely out of your depth." He had just delivered a flawless, uncoerced verbal confession of systemic financial manipulation on a recorded corporate server. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. The feigned uncertainty vanished instantly, replaced by the ruthless certainty of a predator closing its jaws. I pressed the hotkey again, ending and encrypting the audio file. "I am an actuary," Philip, I whispered, leaning forward until we were mere inches apart. "My entire job is assessing depth. Did you ever bother to read the underwriting disclosures on the bank that holds your little shell company?" He blinked, his false bravado faltering as the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice losing its forceful edge. "Hartford Premier Insurance provides the primary liability coverage for that specific banking institution," I explained, my words slicing through the tense air like a scalpel. "They are our client. That means my division holds supreme regulatory oversight regarding any suspected fiduciary fraud occurring within their vaults. You did not just upset your daughter-in-law. You triggered a binding federal compliance event monitored by a multi-billion-dollar underwriter. I do not need to call the police. I simply hand my risk assessment report to our internal legal department, and they are federally mandated to freeze your entire existence." The realization pierced his aristocratic delusion with devastating force. The air rushed out of his lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp. He looked around the sleek glass office, finally understanding he had walked willingly into an execution chamber. The powerful Greenwich patriarch crumbled into a terrified old man right before my eyes. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly against the polished floor. He did not issue another threat. He did not demand my loyalty. He turned and practically sprinted toward the glass doors, fleeing down the pristine corporate hallway in a blind, panicked sweat. I stood alone in the quiet office, listening to his frantic footsteps fade toward the elevator banks. I logged into my terminal, accessing the newly created audio file. I played the playback, listening to his crisp, arrogant voice, claiming exclusive signatory rights over the stolen church funds. I verified the audio clarity and immediately backed the recording up to an impenetrable offshore cloud server, adding it to the master spreadsheet containing the routing logs. Philip thought his impromptu act of espionage would intimidate me into silence. Instead, he provided the exact verified audio evidence required to seal a federal indictment. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, savoring the bitter dark roast. The external war against my in-laws was effectively won. They were trapped in a mathematical cage with no viable exits, but the rot of their greed was not confined to their coastal estate. As I watched the digital progress bar finish the cloud transfer, a sharp ping chimed from my personal cell phone resting in my purse. The notification light flashed, signaling an emergency banking alert. The syndicate I was dismantling had a desperate, compromised operative living inside my own house, and my husband was about to make a fatal, catastrophic choice. The drive home from the insurance headquarters felt entirely surreal. I had just dismantled my father-in-law inside my own corporate fortress, leaving him sprinting for the elevators in a cold sweat. The external threat was successfully neutralized, but the most dangerous vulnerabilities are always harbored inside the perimeter. I unlocked the front door of our Connecticut townhouse. The evening air felt still and quiet. Hannah had already taken my son to the park for an afternoon outing, providing me a rare moment of undisturbed solitude. I placed my briefcase on the entryway console and slipped off my heels. Before I could even pour a glass of water, my phone vibrated in the pocket of my blazer. A sharp, distinct chime echoed through the silent hallway. It was the specific ringtone assigned to my secure banking application. I retrieved the device and unlocked the screen, expecting a routine statement update. Instead, a glaring red notification banner filled the display. A priority fraud alert warned me that an unauthorized wire transfer had just been executed from my primary individual checking reserve. The amount was $5,000. I stared at the glowing digits. This was not a joint fund. This was my personal salary depository, a secure ledger I maintained entirely separate from our shared household expenses. My mind raced through potential security breaches. I walked briskly into my home office and booted up my terminal. I bypassed the standard banking app and accessed the direct routing logs via the web portal. The transaction details loaded onto the screen. The $5,000 had been routed directly into the primary checking account belonging to Philip and Diana. A thief had breached my firewall, but it was not a faceless hacker operating from an overseas server. The digital footprint was remarkably localized. I pulled the network router history and traced the originating internet protocol address. The request did not originate from an external network. It pinged directly from the wireless router sitting on my own living room shelf. I cross-referenced the media access control address attached to the transfer. It matched the exact hardware identifier of the sleek silver laptop issued to my husband. Nathan was sitting in the very next room executing financial theft against his own wife. He had evidently memorized my security login, bypassing the two-factor authentication by intercepting the prompt on our shared family tablet. He bypassed my boundaries to appease his terrified parents. In a desperate, cowardly bid to soothe their bruised egos and fund their immediate cash deficit, my husband had stolen my hard-earned salary to pay Diana her extortionate babysitting invoice. He likely padded the rest of the sum to offer them a pathetic financial apology for my earlier defiance at the church. I stepped away from my monitors. The silence in the townhouse felt suffocating. I walked down the carpeted hallway and stood in the doorway of the den. Nathan was casually folding a series of pastel polo shirts and placing them into a leather duffel bag. He was preparing for an exclusive weekend golf trip to a coastal resort with his father. He hummed a quiet tune, looking entirely unburdened by the profound betrayal he had just committed. I did not raise my voice. I leaned against the doorframe, folding my arms across my chest. "I see you decided to pay your mother her hourly rate," I stated, my tone devoid of any inflection. "And you added a generous bonus." Nathan froze. The polo shirt in his hands dropped back into the leather bag. He slowly turned to face me. He did not look ashamed. He did not offer a frantic apology or claim it was an accident. His face twisted into a grotesque mask of patriarchal indignation. He realized he was caught, and instead of showing remorse, he chose to attack. "You left me no choice, Catherine," he snapped, his voice elevating into a shrill defensive pitch. "You have been acting like a paranoid lunatic all week. You humiliated my mother at the Sunday service. You insulted my father. They are dealing with sensitive liquidity transitions, and you are trying to tear this prestigious family apart over petty change. $5,000 means nothing to your salary, but it means everything to preserving the peace." I watched him justify felony theft. You stole from my private reserve, Nathan. You bypassed a security protocol to drain my earnings. It is our money, he shouted, stepping toward me with a fierce, unyielding glare. You are my wife. What belongs to you belongs to this household. You are trying to sabotage my inheritance because you cannot handle the fact that my parents hold authority. I smoothed things over. I fixed the disaster you created. You should be thanking me for protecting our future. I stood perfectly still. The man shouting at me was a stranger. He was a hollow vessel echoing the narcissistic demands of the syndicate that raised him. He officially chose the criminal enterprise over his own wife and child. He viewed my career as a convenient piggy bank designed to fund his familial obligations. Any lingering shred of empathy I harbored for the man I married extinguished in that exact moment. The warm, vibrant core of our relationship turned into cold, solid ash. An actuary does not argue with a sinking ship. She calculates the optimal moment to jump and ensures she takes the lifeboats with her. If I confronted his logic or threatened divorce right now, he would simply call his parents and alert them to my defensive posture. They would utilize their remaining social capital to hire ruthless litigators, locking my assets in a protracted legal battle. I needed him docile. I needed him to believe his outburst had successfully subdued my rebellious spirit. I allowed my shoulders to drop forward, simulating the physical collapse of a broken woman. I widened my eyes, forcing a sudden, frantic moisture to pool in my tear ducts. I let out a ragged breath, bringing a trembling hand up to cover my mouth. I just wanted to protect our son, I whispered, forcing my voice to crack with fabricated despair. I felt so overwhelmed, Nathan. Your mother hates me, and I was just trying to create a boundary. I never wanted to ruin your relationship with your father. Nathan paused. The fierce anger in his eyes melted into a smug, triumphant satisfaction. He believed the tears. He believed his loud, assertive tone had successfully crushed my defiance and restored his rightful place as the dominant head of the household. He walked over and placed a patronizing hand on my shoulder, offering a hollow, comforting squeeze. "It is fine, Catherine," he murmured, his tone shifting back to his usual cowardly condescension. "You just need to learn your place in this dynamic. My parents know what is best for us. Let me handle the finances and the family relations from now on. You just focus on your little risk models at work. I will see you on Sunday evening. Try to have a better attitude when I get back." He zipped up his leather duffel bag, slung the strap over his shoulder, and walked out the front door. The lock clicked shut with a sharp metallic finality. The second his car pulled out of the driveway, the tears dried instantly. I stood up straight, wiping the manufactured moisture from my cheeks. A genuine cold smile touched the corners of my mouth. Nathan thought he had just won the ultimate marital victory, securing his weekend getaway and placating his desperate parents. He was entirely unaware of the catastrophic trap he had just willingly triggered. By illegally accessing an individual account without formal authorization, Nathan had committed actionable wire fraud against a domestic financial institution. He thought the $5,000 was a minor peace offering. He failed to comprehend the severe banking regulations governing solo proprietorship funds. His illicit digital signature provided me with the exact legal justification required to bypass standard marital property laws. He had just handed me the supreme unilateral authority to initiate an emergency financial protocol that would strip him of everything he owned. I walked back to my home office, locked the door, and prepared to execute a surgical amputation. The weekend was just beginning, and by the time Nathan returned from the golf course, his entire existence would be locked behind an impenetrable wall of corporate glass. Friday evening arrived, accompanied by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the glass of my home office. The illusion of my defeat hung heavily in the air. Nathan was miles away, sipping expensive scotch at a coastal golf resort, relishing his perceived victory. Actuaries understand that the most effective defense in any hostile negotiation is a well-crafted diversion. I needed my husband and his parents looking in the wrong direction, while I dismantled the foundation of their lives. A month prior, I had detected a clumsy keystroke logger embedded deep within my personal laptop background processes. Nathan installed the spyware to monitor my communications, proving his inherent paranoia. I left the surveillance software intact, recognizing its immense value as a conduit for strategic disinformation. I opened my email client and composed a message to a prominent Hartford family law attorney. I deliberately crafted the text to sound hysterical, desperate, and erratic. I typed frantic questions about the penalties for early withdrawal, asking how quickly I could cash out my entire retirement portfolio to survive a pending divorce. I hit send. The bait dropped smoothly into the water. Nathan was likely sitting in a plush leather chair right at that moment, reading the intercepted text on his phone. He would immediately alert Philip. They would spend their entire weekend scrambling to draft emergency legal injunctions to freeze my 401k, wasting their time and resources guarding a phantom target. While their attention fixated on the decoy, I initiated a swift, unmerciful financial amputation. I accessed a highly secure encrypted virtual private network. My tenure evaluating global insurance liabilities granted me elite connections within international corporate registries. I bypassed domestic constraints and contacted a specialized fiduciary firm located in the Cayman Islands. Within a few hours, a bespoke offshore entity breathed its first digital breath under the name Horizon Risk Management LLC. This fortress featured impenetrable privacy safeguards, impervious to standard civil subpoenas, without years of protracted federal litigation. It was a pristine, untraceable vault designed to shield my hard-earned wealth from the syndicate. The dark irony of constructing a shell company to combat a family of money launderers provided a quiet, grim satisfaction. Saturday arrived with clinical purpose. I targeted the banking infrastructure first. I contacted the Central Fraud Division of our primary domestic institution. I did not request a standard password reset. I presented the irrefutable IP logs and device identifiers documenting Nathan enacting a digital theft of $5,000 from my isolated salary reserve. Banks harbor zero tolerance for authenticated cyber theft, regardless of the perpetrator's marital status. Utilizing my professional cadence and citing specific federal banking regulations, I compelled the compliance officer to trigger an unyielding protective freeze on his credentials. His debit access, his credit lines, his mobile login portals evaporated in a fraction of a second. The door slammed shut from the inside. The eradication phase accelerated rapidly. With Nathan legally barred from the interface, I commenced the systemic drainage of our shared liquidity. I routed my accumulated corporate bonuses, the liquid cash from our joint savings, and the available equity line of credit directly into the newly minted offshore ledger. I watched the digital numbers cascade across my dual monitors. Hundreds of thousands of dollars migrated safely into my fortified corporate shell, leaving behind a trail of stunning zeros. I left exactly $125 in the primary checking account, serving as a silent, mocking tribute to Diana's hourly babysitting rate. The financial lifeline Nathan relied upon to sustain his hollow boutique investment firm ceased to exist. He was functionally bankrupt and entirely unaware. Sunday morning ushered in a cold, relentless Connecticut drizzle, slicking the cobblestone walkways of our townhouse. Financial eradication requires a matching physical barrier. I hired an emergency commercial locksmith. The technician arrived and swapped the standard residential locks for high-grade steel cylinders. The heavy brass tumblers clicked into place, rendering Nathan's old keys obsolete. I ascended the staircase to the master suite. Nathan derived immense pride from his curated wardrobe. His closet was a shrine to unearned luxury, featuring tailored Italian suits, cashmere sweaters, and imported leather loafers. I did not fold the garments. I dragged thick, black, industrial trash bags into the center of the room. I tossed the bespoke jackets and expensive silk ties into the plastic liners, tying the tops with harsh efficiency. I dragged the heavy bags downstairs, pulling them out onto the exposed, rain-slicked front porch. The damp weather would inevitably seep through the plastic seams. Sunday evening descended, blanketing the neighborhood in deep shadows. I sat at my kitchen island, sipping a dark roast coffee, watching the high-definition security camera feed on my tablet. A luxury SUV glided into the driveway. Nathan stepped out, laughing at a joke his father told through the Bluetooth headset. He strode up the wet concrete steps, his golf club slung effortlessly over his shoulder. He expected to find a submissive, weeping wife ready to apologize for questioning his authority. He reached into his pocket for his keys. He inserted the brass into the lock. It caught against the new tumblers. He jiggled the metal, a deep confusion wrinkling his brow. He rattled the heavy handle. It remained unyielding. His gaze dropped from the wooden door to the dark plastic bags resting in puddles of rainwater near his designer boots. The realization began to fracture his arrogant demeanor. He pulled out his smartphone, attempting to access the banking application, to hire a locksmith, or perhaps book a hotel room for the night. The screen flashed a stark, unforgiving error code indicating his credentials were terminated. He refreshed the page, his thumb tapping frantically against the glass. Access denied. He was stranded on the damp pavement, stripped of his wealth, his home, and his perceived power. He stared at the camera lens, his face pale with sudden terrifying clarity, but the shockwave of his exile would not remain contained to my front porch. The moment he called his mother to beg for shelter, Diana would realize her financial leverage over me had evaporated. Her desperate need for control would inevitably mutate into a vicious, highly publicized social retaliation designed to destroy my name in the very circles she worshipped. The rain had barely dried on the pavement outside my townhouse before Nathan sought refuge in the only place that would harbor a disinherited parasite. He drove his luxury sedan straight back to his parents' coastal estate, seeking comfort under the vaulted ceilings of Greenwich. I monitored his vehicle tracking signature via our shared auto insurance portal, watching the digital icon cross the county line. The moment he stepped into their marble foyer and confessed that his keys were useless and his credit limits were zero, the power dynamic shifted. Diana and Philip were stripped of their primary funding source. Their boutique investment son was bankrupt, and the silent actuary who subsidized their lives had fortified her borders. Deprived of my salary and terrified of the forensic audit I was conducting on their fraudulent church ledgers, Diana deployed the only weapon she had left. She launched a coordinated social retaliation. She utilized her established reign at the elite Long Island Sound Yacht Club as ground zero for her preemptive strike. The club was a bastion of old money influence where reputations were built or dismantled over glasses of overpriced Chardonnay and rounds of polite tennis. Diana knew that if she could assassinate my character first, any financial crimes I later exposed would be dismissed as the erratic ravings of a scorned, unstable woman. She held court on the sprawling teak deck overlooking the harbor, weaving a tapestry of horrific, fabricated rumors to her captive audience of affluent peers. Diana painted a vivid picture of a mother unhinged. She whispered to the influential wives of local politicians and banking executives that the stress of my corporate career had finally fractured my fragile mind. She claimed I was actively neglecting her beloved grandson, leaving him in squalor, while I suffered a severe psychological breakdown. To add a sinister layer to her narrative, she targeted Hannah. Diana insisted my new nanny was a dangerous radical cult member hired specifically to brainwash the boy and sever his ties from his loving grandparents. She presented herself as the tragic, weeping matriarch, desperate to save her lineage from a sick daughter-in-law. Toxic gossip in Connecticut high society moves faster than a coastal hurricane. Within 72 hours, the whispers bled out of the yacht club and seeped directly into the executive suites of my Hartford insurance firm. The corporate world is exceptionally sensitive to reputational risk. By Thursday morning, I received a discreet calendar invitation for a closed-door meeting with my managing directors. I walked into the boardroom wearing a tailored slate suit, projecting an aura of undisturbed professional equilibrium. Two senior partners sat across the table, their expressions laced with polite concern. They informed me that troubling social rumors had reached their ears. They questioned if my home life was introducing undue stress, suggesting perhaps a temporary leave of absence would be beneficial to protect the firm public standing. Diana intended for this exact outcome. She wanted my superiors to view me as a liability, effectively suffocating my remaining income stream. I did not offer a tearful defense. An actuary never pleads. She presents data. I looked my managing directors in the eye and delivered a calm, precise explanation. I informed them that my estranged husband and his family were currently under investigation for severe fiduciary mismanagement and were utilizing retaliatory defamation to obscure their impending insolvency. I assured the partners that my operational output remained flawless, providing them a dossier of my recent risk models as proof. My stoic delivery and the undeniable quality of my work extinguished their concerns immediately. I walked out of the boardroom with my position secure, but the encounter illuminated a stark reality. Diana's social poison required swift, unmerciful neutralization. I returned to my locked townhouse that evening and sat down with Hannah at the kitchen island. I explained the specific lies circulating about her character. Instead of showing fear, Hannah's eyes hardened with a quiet, formidable resolve. Her ties to the coastal church meant she maintained deep connections with several prominent parishioners who also held memberships at the yacht club. Individuals who despised Diana's tyrannical behavior but lacked the courage to challenge her directly. Hannah possessed the exact social access I needed to convert whispered gossip into actionable legal artillery. We spent the weekend executing a discreet intelligence gathering operation. Hannah reached out to her trusted contacts, scheduling quiet coffees and private phone calls. We asked them to formally document the exact statements Diana uttered on the yacht club deck. People are often hesitant to intervene in family drama, but when informed they are assisting in a defamation inquiry against a local tyrant, their willingness to participate increases exponentially. Within 4 days, I possessed 7 distinct sworn affidavits. The testimonies detailed the precise dates, times, and specific verbiage Diana used to assassinate my professional and maternal credibility. They corroborated her malicious claims regarding my mental stability and the absurd cult allegations against Hannah. Diana's arrogance had blinded her. She assumed her elite status granted her immunity from consequences, believing her words would merely evaporate into the salt air. She failed to realize that documented lies constitute defamation per se. She had practically gift-wrapped the exact legal leverage I required to drag them into a controlled environment. With the affidavits securely digitized, I drafted a formal communication. It was not a plea for peace. It was a highly calibrated cease and desist mandate paired with an invitation to a private divorce mediation. I utilized the strict, unyielding language of a corporate litigator. I outlined the exact statutes Diana had violated, attaching redacted previews of the sworn testimonies to prove my threat possessed real teeth. I demanded they meet me in a neutral downtown Hartford conference room to finalize the separation of assets and arrange custody terms for my son. I explicitly structured the invitation to project an illusion of fatigue. I layered the text with subtle indicators of financial exhaustion, offering them the prospect of a quiet surrender if they simply ceased their public attacks. I needed them to believe the social pressure had successfully broken my spirit. I wanted Philip and Diana to think they were marching into that room to dictate the terms of my total defeat. They swallowed the bait without a single moment of hesitation. Their shared attorney, a pompous litigator accustomed to bullying weaker opponents, sent a swift confirmation replying that they eagerly anticipated resolving the unfortunate marital friction. They truly believed they had won. They envisioned a scenario where I handed over my remaining equity and apologized for daring to challenge their authority. They were packing their tailored suits and preparing their victorious speeches, entirely oblivious to the fact that the mediation room was not a negotiating table. It was a meticulously designed slaughterhouse, and they had just eagerly scheduled their own execution. The sterile downtown Hartford conference room smelled of harsh cleaning chemicals and stale espresso. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a panoramic view of the bustling financial district, establishing a stark contrast to the suffocating stillness inside our meeting space. I arrived 20 minutes early, deliberately staging my physical appearance to manipulate the psychological atmosphere. I wore a muted gray suit, selecting a fabric that hung just a fraction too loose, making me appear physically diminished. I skipped concealer, allowing the dark circles beneath my eyes to stand out against my pale skin. I needed to project the flawless image of a mother running on empty, a professional whose spirit had been fractured by relentless social warfare. The heavy oak door swung open, and the opposition entered. Philip and Diana walked in first, flanked by 2 expensive, sharp-suited litigators from a premier boutique firm. Nathan trailed behind them, projecting the smug, cowardly posture of a man hiding securely behind his parents' wealth. They took their seats on the opposite side of the sprawling mahogany table. Diana smoothed her designer skirt, offering me a tight, condescending smile. She truly believed her yacht club gossip had successfully ruined my life. Their lead counsel, a rigid man named Strickland, opened his leather briefcase with a crisp snap. He cleared his throat, preparing to launch into a practiced, intimidating monologue designed to overwhelm me. I preempted his speech by sliding a dense 40-page settlement agreement across the polished wood. The thick stack of papers stopped directly in front of his pristine legal pad. I folded my hands in my lap, keeping my gaze fixed firmly on the tabletop, executing a seamless performance of a financially exhausted woman begging for peace. Strickland adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the cover page. He expected a simple surrender, but it needed to construct a highly complex diversion. In corporate risk management, if you want an auditor to ignore a fatal flaw in the ledger, you must provide them with a loud, chaotic distraction elsewhere. I engineered a spectacular red herring, centered entirely around our Connecticut townhouse. As Strickland turned to the asset division section, I immediately interjected, my voice trembling with manufactured desperation. I pleaded to keep the residence. I insisted that our son needed stability, arguing that pulling him away from his familiar nursery would cause irreversible emotional damage. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table, begging Nathan to leave us the house. The bait worked flawlessly. The elite lawyers instantly pounced on the real estate equity, their predatory instincts triggered by my sudden display of weakness. For the next 80 minutes, the conference room devolved into a fierce, exhausting battle over property appraisals, mortgage contributions, and residential entitlements. Nathan argued about the initial down payment, puffing out his chest to assert dominance. Philip scoffed loudly, stating that I had no right to claim a home his son had helped furnish. Diana chimed in, criticizing my interior decorating, attempting to devalue the property just to inflict further emotional damage. Negotiation fatigue is a documented psychological phenomenon. When individuals engage in prolonged, intense arguments over a specific high-visibility target, their cognitive endurance depletes. They secure a victory in one arena, and their critical thinking mechanisms power down, assuming the rest of the battlefield is clear. After enduring an hour and a half of their venomous insults, I enacted the surrender. I let my shoulders slump forward, burying my face in my hands. I forced a ragged, tearful sob to escape my throat. "I concede the property," I whispered, wiping a fabricated tear from my cheek. "I will vacate the premises by the end of the month. I waive all claims to spousal alimony, and I will issue a formal written apology to your church congregation regarding the misunderstanding with the nanny. I just want this nightmare to end." The shift in the room was electric. Diana posture straightened, her eyes gleaming with unadulterated triumph. Obtaining a public apology meant her social standing would be forever vindicated among the coastal elite. Nathan leaned back in his plush leather chair, exhaling a loud sigh of relief, thrilled to escape the marriage without paying a single dime in support. Philip tapped his fingers against the table, eager to finalize the transaction and legally claim the lucrative real estate equity. Strickland, satisfied with the overwhelming concessions he had just secured for his clients, began skimming the remainder of the dense settlement tacket. He flipped past the custody schedules and the standard non-disparagement clauses, his attention drifting. He reached page 38. Page 38 contained the snare. Hidden beneath layers of tedious corporate legalese was a specialized indemnity and assumption clause. To the fatigued eye, it read like a standard boilerplate hold harmless agreement regarding familial investments. In reality, the phrasing was surgical. It explicitly stated that Philip and Diana Schmidt hereby assume unconditional legal ownership and total fiduciary liability for the Educational Trust Fund and its parent holding shell, Coastal Heritage LLC. The text transferred every ounce of legal burden, past and present, from my household directly onto their shoulders. Strickland paused, his pen hovering over the dense paragraphs. He frowned, his legal training prompting a momentary hesitation. He opened his mouth, preparing to question the specific phrasing of the holding shell assumption. Philip interrupted him. Impatience and raw greed clouded the older man's judgment. He looked at his expensive wristwatch, irritated by the delay. "Stop billing me for reading the fine print, Strickland." Philip snapped, his tone dripping with arrogant authority. "She gave up the house. She waived the alimony. The girl is broke and defeated. Just show me where to sign so we can conclude this miserable chapter." The lawyer hesitated, glancing from the dense text to his impatient, wealthy client. The pressure to please the patriarch overrode his professional caution. Strickland flipped to the final signature page, aligning the documents and pointing to the designated lines. Philip withdrew a heavy gold fountain pen from his breast pocket. He signed his name with a swift, arrogant flourish. Diana eagerly took the pen next to her cursive script, scratching loudly against the crisp paper, cementing her perceived victory. Nathan provided the final signature, legally severing our union, while simultaneously plunging himself into profound jeopardy. They pushed the finalized packet across the mahogany surface. I gathered my copy, sliding the thick stack of paper into my leather portfolio. The moment the brass clasp clicked shut, the performance concluded. I stood up from the ergonomic chair. I did not slouch. I smoothed the wrinkles from my gray jacket, my spine straightening into a rigid, unyielding line. The manufactured tears evaporated from my eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. Philip noticed the sudden shift in my demeanor. His smug smile faltered slightly as he watched me walk toward the glass door with steady, purposeful strides. They believed they had just legally stolen my assets. They believed they had successfully bullied a fractured mother into profound poverty. I stepped out of the sterile conference room and into the bustling Hartford corridor, the heavy door sealing the toxic syndicate inside. The leather portfolio in my hand felt weightless. They had ignored the fine print. They had not just claimed a minor college fund, they had signed an irrefutable, legally binding confession, officially absorbing total liability for the federal wire fraud and church embezzlement I had meticulously uncovered. The snare had snapped permanently shut, and my next destination was a grand crystal-draped banquet hall to trigger the execution. The signed indemnity clause rested securely inside a fireproof safe hidden within my home office, while a certified duplicate sat perfectly aligned inside a thick red forensic binder. The legal snare had successfully closed around my former family. They walked out of the downtown Hartford mediation room, believing they had stripped me of my assets, my pride, and my future. They thought I would retreat into the shadows to mourn the demise of my marriage. An actuary does not mourn a corrected ledger. She finalizes the audit. Armed with their legally binding confessions, I meticulously prepared the theater for their swift, undisputed ruin. The execution required a highly visible arena. A private confrontation would only allow them to spin another web of lies behind closed doors, utilizing their old money connections to bury the evidence. I needed an audience of their peers. I needed the very society they worship to bear witness to their crimes. The Grace Coastal Fellowship Annual Charity Gala presented the ultimate stage. This high society event was the crown jewel of the Greenwich Elite social calendar, specifically organized to celebrate the newly funded community building project. It was the exact same fictitious project Philip and Diana had used to launder stolen donations through my Son Educational Trust. Securing access to this exclusive gathering required precision. The guest list was guarded by a strict committee of affluent gatekeepers who would have instantly rejected my name. This is where the quiet brilliance of Hannah proved invaluable. During her tenure as the charity treasurer, Hannah had personally designed the digital ticketing infrastructure for these events. She knew the software architecture better than anyone currently employed by the congregation. Furthermore, her unassuming nature had always made her practically invisible to the wealthy wives who viewed administrative staff as mere background fixtures. Hannah utilized her lingering administrative credentials to access the seating chart 48 hours prior to the event. She did not hack the system or trigger any security alerts. She simply logged in using a backdoor administrative portal she had created years ago for emergency event management. She seamlessly bumped a minor local politician to a secondary tier and inserted my name onto the primary benefactor table. I was officially seated right next to the head pastor. The digital trail was wiped clean, ensuring Diana would not see the seating arrangement until the plated dinner commenced. The evening of the gala brought a sharp coastal chill off the Long Island Sound. I stood before my full-length mirror, finalizing my preparation. During the mediation, I had worn muted gray to project financial exhaustion and defeat. Tonight, I required armor. I selected a stunning floor-length emerald gown, the fabric draped with razor-sharp structural elegance, projecting an aura of undisturbed power and lethal confidence. I clasped a simple silver necklace around my throat, applied a bold crimson lipstick, and picked up the red forensic binder. I arrived at the Harborview Country Club an hour after the cocktail reception began. The venue was a spectacular display of staggering wealth and misplaced piety. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over tables draped in imported ivory silk. Towering centerpieces of white orchids dominated the room, while a live string quartet played soft classical arrangements in the corner. Waiters in crisp black uniforms circulated with silver trays, offering premium champagne to the local elite. I handed my invitation to the attendant at the entrance. He scanned the barcode, his screen glowing green with immediate approval. The heavy oak doors swung open, and I stepped over the threshold into the opulent banquet hall. My entrance did not cause an immediate disruption. I blended seamlessly into the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. I navigated through the outer rings of tables, my eyes scanning the room for my targets. I spotted them holding court near the grand stage. Diana was draped in a shimmering silver evening gown, holding a crystal flute and laughing at a joke told by a local banking executive. Philip stood beside her, projecting the image of a benevolent patriarch. Nathan hovered slightly behind them, holding a scotch glass, looking like a shadow of a man. I paused near a towering ice sculpture, allowing the visual geometry of the room to shift. Nathan happened to turn his head toward the entrance. His gaze swept past the ice sculpture and landed directly on me. The transformation in his posture was instantaneous. His jaw slackened and his hand twitched, causing a splash of amber liquid to spill over the rim of his crystal glass onto his expensive shoes. He grabbed his father's shoulder, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. Philip turned his aristocratic smile, faltering. He tapped Diana on the arm, drawing her attention. The trio stared at me in stunned, unblinking disbelief. Cognitive dissonance paralyzed them. They had spent the entire week celebrating my supposed financial ruin. They expected me to be sitting in a dark apartment weeping over a broken marriage and an empty bank account. Seeing me glide through the most exclusive room in Connecticut wearing a gown that commanded attention shattered their fabricated reality. Philip handed his drink to a passing waiter. His face hardened into a mask of pure indignation. He murmured a swift excuse to his colleagues and marched directly toward me, slicing through the crowd with urgent, heavy strides. He intended to intercept my path before I could reach the center of the hall. I did not alter my trajectory. I continued walking with calm, measured steps, meeting him halfway near a row of tall, floral arrangements. Philip stepped directly into my path, attempting to use his broad shoulders to physically block my advance. "You do not belong here, Catherine," he hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. His eyes darted nervously to the surrounding guests, ensuring no one overheard his hostility. "This is an exclusive private function. You surrendered your ties to this family on Tuesday. Turn around and walk out those doors before I summon security and have you thrown out for trespassing." I stopped smoothing the silk fabric of my emerald skirt. I looked up at him, maintaining a cool, unyielding gaze. "I am not trespassing, Philip," I replied, my tone perfectly level and carrying a chilling clarity. "I am a registered guest. If you consult the primary seating chart, you will find my name listed at the benefactor table." His face flushed a deep mottled crimson. "You are lying," he sputtered, stepping an inch closer. "Diana finalized that seating chart herself. You are trying to cause a desperate scene because you lost everything in the mediation. You are a bitter woman attempting to ruin an evening dedicated to holy charity. I will not allow you to embarrass my wife." I offered him a tight, terrifyingly polite smile. "You should focus less on my presence and more on the structural integrity of your own ledgers, Philip." I stepped smoothly to the right, effortlessly bypassing his rigid stance. "Enjoy the catering. I hear the main course is unforgettable." I left him standing near the orchids, vibrating with suppressed panic. I continued my deliberate procession toward the front of the room. The primary benefactor table sat directly beneath the grand stage, offering an unobstructed view of the glowing podium. I approached my assigned seat. The gold-embossed place card read my full name in elegant calligraphy. I took my seat, placing the thick red binder on the table directly next to my dinner plate. The head pastor, a man in his late 60s with silver hair and a practiced pastoral smile, occupied the chair to my immediate left. He turned to greet me, extending a warm, welcoming hand. He recognized my face from previous Sunday services, but clearly remained oblivious to the toxic domestic warfare escalating behind the scenes. "Welcome, Catherine," he said, his voice projecting practiced warmth. "It is a true blessing to see you here tonight. Philip and Diana have been such pillars of our community building project. We are so grateful for the family continued support." I shook his hand, my grip firm and resolute. "The community building project is exactly what brought me here tonight, Pastor," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "The financial architecture behind this initiative is truly fascinating. I believe tonight's presentation will bring a wealth of clarity to the congregation." He nodded enthusiastically, entirely missing the lethal subtext of my statement. He turned his attention back to his meal, ignorant of the forensic explosive resting just inches from his elbow. I glanced back toward the center of the room. Philip had rejoined Diana and Nathan. The three of them were huddled together, whispering frantically. Diana's face was drawn tight with anxiety. She kept shooting nervous, panicked glances toward my table, trying to comprehend how a ruined woman had secured a seat beside the most powerful religious figure in their social circle. She wanted to storm over and drag me away, but her obsession with public decorum kept her anchored. She could not risk a loud confrontation in front of the regional bishop sitting at the adjacent table. She was trapped by her own desperate need to maintain her flawless facade. The ambient lights in the banquet hall slowly dimmed, signaling the commencement of the formal program. A single bright spotlight illuminated the grand stage, carving a stark white circle out of the shadows. The string quartet faded into silence. The master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone, welcoming the elite crowd and praising their unparalleled generosity. After a brief introduction, the announcer called the guest of honor to the stage. Diana adjusted her silver gown, smoothing imaginary wrinkles from the expensive fabric. She plastered a radiant, humble smile onto her face, hiding the suffocating dread lurking just beneath the surface. She ascended the brief staircase, her diamond necklace catching the intense glare of the spotlight. Diana stepped up to the glowing acrylic podium. She looked out over the sea of wealthy faces basking in their silent adoration. She gripped the edges of the podium, preparing to deliver a sprawling, emotional speech detailing her immense philanthropic sacrifices and her tireless dedication to the Community Building Fund. She stood at the absolute epicenter of her high society universe, entirely unaware that her grand moment of supreme triumph was the designated drop zone for a federal execution. The spotlight tracking Diana across the grand stage cast a brilliant halo around her silver designer gown. She gripped the edges of the clear acrylic podium, projecting the polished image of a selfless, high society philanthropist. Her voice, amplified by the pristine acoustic system of the banquet hall, echoed with practiced theatrical humility. She spoke eloquently about sacrifice, detailing the tireless hours her family had dedicated to the new community building project. She swept her hand toward the audience, praising the wealthy parishioners for their boundless generosity, claiming that together they had raised unprecedented capital to secure a bright future for the congregation. The room was captivated, hanging on to her every word while raising their champagne flutes in silent admiration. I sat near the front of the room, bathed in the ambient shadows beyond the stage lighting. My posture remained rigid, my hands resting lightly upon the thick red spine of the forensic audit binder. The head pastor sat to my immediate left, nodding along to Diana with an expression of profound gratitude. He clapped softly as she recited a fabricated anecdote about a local child who would supposedly benefit from their new charitable initiative. The sheer hypocrisy dripping from her pristine narrative was staggering, but it provided the perfect contrasting backdrop for the execution I was about to deliver. I did not wait for her to finish her closing remarks. The moment required a surgical interruption to maximize the psychological impact. I placed my palm flat against the cover of the red binder and applied a firm, steady pressure. I slid the heavy dossier across the crisp white linen tablecloth. The thick binding scraped softly against the fabric, coming to a definitive halt right next to the head pastor crystal water goblet. He blinked, pulling his attention away from the glowing podium. He looked down at the unexpected item intruding upon his pristine place setting. His brow furrowed in mild confusion, and he turned his head toward me, preparing to offer a polite inquiry regarding the intrusion. I did not whisper. In a room full of elite socialites trained to communicate through subtle gestures and hushed tones, a clear, carrying voice operates like a physical shockwave. I pitched my words to cut directly through the ambient noise, ensuring the regional bishop seated at the adjacent table and the wealthy banking executives hovering nearby heard every single syllable with crystal clarity. Pastor, I believe you need to review the actual architectural blueprints of your community project, I stated, my tone devoid of any warmth or hesitation. The financial foundation Diana is currently boasting about is entirely hollow. The head pastor offered a strained, uncertain chuckle, assuming I was making a dry, poorly timed joke. I am afraid I do not follow, Catherine, he murmured, keeping his voice low in a desperate attempt to preserve the dignified atmosphere of his table. Diana and Philip have been instrumental in securing the capital for our expansion. I reached over and flipped open the heavy red cover. The first page displayed a stark, undeniable visual, a comprehensive flowchart tracking the illicit movement of the parishioner donations. I am an actuary, Pastor, I replied, tapping my index finger against the bold black routing numbers printed on the ledger. I trace liability and I hunt risk. The capital your congregation so generously donated did not go toward a community center. Over the past 12 months, Philip and Diana methodically diverted $1.2 million of church funds directly into a private shell entity known as Coastal Heritage LLC. The clinking of silverware at the surrounding VIP tables abruptly ceased. The influential donors seated nearby stiffened, straining their ears to catch the impossible accusation being leveled at their guest of honor. The head pastor face lost its warm, healthy hue, instantly turning a sickening shade of ashen gray. His trembling fingers reached out to touch the glossy pages of the audit. He stared at the irrefutable bank logs displaying the exact dates and matching deposit amounts, draining his sacred treasury. He saw the routing digits leading straight from the church primary accounts into the shadowy offshore holdings. I turned the page, presenting the ultimate piece of forensic poetry. Pinned beneath a clear protective sleeve with a high-resolution scan of a very specific document. It was the $50,000 landscaping vendor invoice, the exact piece of fabricated paperwork Diana had tried to force Hannah to authorize 3 months prior. The very same error she had frantically cited in her kitchen when she demanded an exorbitant hourly rate to watch my son. Look closely at that invoice, I instructed, watching the older man struggle to draw a steady breath. It authorizes a massive payment for structural soil grading on a parcel of land that does not exist in the municipal zoning records. When your former charity treasurer refused to sign this fraudulent order, Diana banished her to conceal the leak. They have been utilizing my 2-year-old son educational trust as a tax haven to park your stolen donations. They bled your congregation dry to fund their country club lifestyle. A profound, horrifying realization paralyzed the head pastor. He tried to speak, but his vocal cords failed to produce a sound. He was staring at the undeniable destruction of his institution lifeblood, orchestrated by the very woman currently smiling under the stage lights. The murmurs began. They started as sharp intakes of breath from the regional bishop and quickly mutated into a harsh, buzzing wave of scandalized whispers, rippling outward through the elite crowd. High society operates on an unspoken currency of reputation, and the sudden exposure of felony theft instantly bankrupts that standing. The wealthy parishioners turned their hardened judgmental stares toward the stage. Up at the glowing acrylic podium, Diana sensed the dramatic shift in the atmospheric pressure. The warm adulation she had been basking in evaporated, replaced by a chilling collective hostility. She faltered mid-sentence. The expensive microphone amplified her sudden, ragged intake of breath. She peered past the blinding stage lights, her eyes desperately scanning the front rows to identify the source of the disruption. Her gaze landed on the primary benefactor table. She saw the head pastor slumped in his chair looking physically ill. She saw the regional bishop whispering frantically to his legal counsel. And then she saw me. I sat perfectly upright, illuminated by the ambient glow of the chandeliers. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, looking directly back at her. I did not offer a victorious smirk. I maintained the cold, unyielding expression of a predator that had just triggered the final mechanism of a lethal trap. Diana froze. Her fingers gripped the edges of the podium so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. Her jaw slackened, the radiant, aristocratic facade crumbling into raw, unfiltered terror. She recognized the thick red binder resting open on the table. She realized the devastating magnitude of the silence echoing back at her from the crowd. The woman she had tried to starve into submission, the daughter-in-law she had dismissed as an expendable pawn, was holding the irrefutable blueprints to her prison cell. She opened her mouth, attempting to salvage the moment, trying to string together a coherent deflection, but the words died in her throat. She was a fraud, exposed under the brightest lights in Connecticut, and she had nowhere left to hide. I turned one final page in the binder, ensuring the head pastor saw the definitive death blow. I presented the notarized settlement agreement from the downtown Hartford mediation. I pointed directly to the signature line on page 38. If you are wondering how to recover the stolen capital, I suggest you look at this liability assumption clause I added, my voice slicing through the escalating murmurs of the crowd. Philip and Diana were so eager to strip me of my assets during our divorce proceedings that they blindly signed this contract. They legally absorbed total unconditional fiduciary liability for the holding shell containing your missing funds. They handed you a signed confession and a direct path for restitution. The head pastor buried his face in his trembling hands, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the betrayal. The execution was fully primed. I had stripped them of their social armor, exposed their financial crimes to their peers, and legally bound them to the stolen money. There was only one step remaining to finalize their eradication from my life. I lifted my chin and made deliberate eye contact with Diana, who was still paralyzed behind the microphone. I tilted my head slowly, offering a single, crisp nod toward the rear of the banquet hall. The heavy brass latches of the main mahogany doors clicked open with a sharp, echoing finality. The sound severed the buzzing whispers of the crowd, plunging the room into a tense, expectant silence. Two figures stepped over the threshold, crossing from the shadowy corridor into the brilliant light of the gala. They did not wear tailored tuxedos or designer evening gowns. They wore dark, utilitarian suits, projecting an aura of uncompromising authority. Silver badges gleamed subtly from their belts, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. They were lead investigators from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, the exact federal agents I had tipped off with an anonymous encrypted dossier 48 hours prior. The agents did not pause to consult a seating chart or speak to the bewildered event staff. They moved with coordinated tactical precision, marching directly down the center aisle of the banquet hall. The physical weight of federal justice advancing through a room of untouchable elites was breathtaking to witness. The trap had snapped entirely shut, and there was no amount of old money influence that could stop the momentum of the steel jaws closing around my former family. The crisp cadence of federal leather shoes striking the polished floorboards served as the final death knell for the fraudulent empire my in-laws had spent decades constructing. The banquet hall, previously filled with the soft hum of classical music and the gentle clinking of crystal champagne flutes, descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. The two lead investigators from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division moved with a relentless tactical efficiency. They did not pause to consult with the venue security staff or address the bewildered event coordinators. They marched straight down the center aisle, their dark utilitarian suits forming a stark, unyielding contrast against the surrounding sea of imported silk and bespoke tuxedos. Philip had spent his entire 60 years operating under the deeply ingrained delusion that severe legal consequences were reserved strictly for individuals in lower tax brackets. He belonged to a generation of country club patriarchs who firmly believed a firm handshake and a hefty donation could erase any institutional friction. When the lead federal agent bypassed the front tables and unclipped a pair of heavy steel restraints from his belt, that generational delusion fractured into a million irreparable pieces. The primitive instinct of self-preservation hijacked Philip's cognitive functions. He did not attempt to negotiate or summon his expensive legal counsel. He turned on his heel and bolted. His sudden, frantic movement triggered pure chaos among the seated elite. Philip shoved his way through the dense crowd of wealthy parishioners, knocking over a towering centerpiece of white orchids. Glass shattered against the floor as he forcefully pushed a prominent local judge out of his path, desperately sprinting toward the side service exit. He fundamentally underestimated the physical conditioning of federal authorities. The secondary IRS agent broke formation, accelerating with terrifying speed. He intercepted Philip just inches from the swinging kitchen doors. The tactical takedown was swift and unmerciful. The investigator hooked his arm around Philip's shoulder, utilizing the older man's momentum to drive him directly into the ground. Philip hit the imported Italian marble with a sickening thud. The custom tailoring of his expensive wool suit tore along the shoulder seam as the agent pinned his arms behind his back. The patriarch of the prestigious Schmidt lineage grunted in profound physical pain, his cheek pressed flush against the cold, hard stone floor. The pristine illusion of his untouchable wealth evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a desperate, panting criminal, being formally read his Miranda rights in front of the very society he had tirelessly sought to impress. Up on the grand stage, Diana watched her husband fall. The guest of honor stood frozen behind the clear acrylic podium, her knuckles stark white as she gripped the edges of the stand. For years, she had utilized her aristocratic posture and her cutting social dictates to terrorize anyone she deemed inferior holding her position at the Long Island Sound Yacht Club as a supreme shield against accountability. That shield dissolved the moment the lead investigator ascended the carpeted stairs to the stage. Diana's carefully curated image disintegrated in real time. She did not maintain her haughty composure. As the federal agent reached her side and presented his golden badge, her knees simply buckled. She collapsed near the microphone stand, her elaborate silver designer gown pooling around her in a shimmering, messy heap. The highly sensitive acoustic equipment broadcasted her ragged, hyperventilating sobs to the entire banquet hall. The agent reached down, grasping her wrists with clinical detachment. The harsh, metallic click of the handcuffs securing her hands resonated through the towering speakers. "Nathan, please!" Diana shrieked, her voice cracking into a raw, hysterical pitch. Her tear-streaked face turned frantically toward the outer ring of tables, searching the crowd for her son. "Nathan, call the lawyers, access the trust, pay them whatever they want. Save us!" Nathan stood paralyzed near a draped cocktail table. My husband had spent his entire adult life relying on the perpetual safety net of his parents' illicit capital. His boutique investment firm was a hollow vanity project entirely sustained by the very laundered money the federal agents were currently seizing. Conditioned to blindly obey his mother's shrill commands, he fumbled in the pocket of his trousers, retrieving his smartphone with trembling fingers. His breath hitched in his throat as he frantically opened his primary banking application. He intended to wire a massive emergency retainer to a top-tier criminal defense firm, assuming his generational wealth would quickly extinguish the flames of this public nightmare. I watched him from my seat at the VIP table, maintaining the cold, steady observation of a risk actuary watching a predicted mathematical model execute flawlessly. Nathan typed in his biometric passcode, his eyes darting nervously between the screen and his mother-weeping figure on the stage. The loading icon spun for a fraction of a second before the screen flashed a brilliant, unforgiving shade of red. A stark notification banner dominated his display. Access denied. Account frozen pending federal inquiry. Nathan thumb-tapped the glass repeatedly, his initial confusion rapidly mutating into suffocating panic. He tried to pivot to his secondary offshore portals, desperately searching for a hidden reserve of liquid capital. Every single login attempt yielded the exact same terminal error code. He was entirely locked out of the global financial system. He failed to comprehend the brilliant, invisible snare he had willingly stepped into days prior. When Nathan cowardly stole $5,000 from my isolated personal salary reserve to appease his parents' babysitting extortion, he believed he was executing a minor domestic theft. He assumed marital proximity shielded him from prosecution. He was profoundly mistaken. By executing that unauthorized digital wire transfer, he had drawn a direct, traceable line between his personal credentials and the Coastal Heritage Shell Company used to launder the stolen church donations. When I submitted the documented proof of that illicit transfer to the fraud division, I did not merely sever his access to our joint checking accounts. I furnished the Internal Revenue Service with the precise digital footprint required to legally classify him as an active co-conspirator in the embezzlement syndicate. The federal algorithms had flagged his identifying information instantly, triggering a sweeping institutional lockdown on every single asset bearing his name. His trust fund, his boutique firm operating capital, and his emergency reserves were seized by the government. The money was gone. Nathan stared at the red screen, his shoulders slumping as the devastating reality of his destitution crushed the remaining breath from his lungs. He was functionally bankrupt, legally tethered to a federal crime, and completely powerless to rescue the parents he had chosen over his own wife. The reaction of the high society crowd delivered the ultimate layer of poetic justice. These affluent parishioners, the very people who had eagerly consumed Diana Vicious Yacht Club rumors about my mental stability, did not rush forward to offer comfort or legal assistance. The elite social circles of Connecticut operate on a strict currency of optics, and proximity to scandal is treated like a terminal disease. Instead of intervening, they reached into their designer clutches and tailored jackets, withdrawing their smartphones. Dozens of camera lenses focused on the stage and the marble floor. They recorded Philip struggling against the federal restraints. They filmed Diana weeping hysterically into the microphone stand, her silver gown ruined. The modern guillotine is digital, and my in-laws' humiliating downfall was being captured in high definition, destined to circulate through every exclusive country club and corporate boardroom on the eastern seaboard before the night concluded. Their social annihilation was irreversible. I sat back in my chair, feeling a profound, quiet stillness settle deep within my chest. The chaotic noise of the banquet hall, the frantic shouting of the investigators, and the collective gasps of the wealthy onlookers faded into the background. The mathematical equation I had spent weeks formulating had finally reached its perfect, balanced conclusion. The liabilities were liquidated. The threat was neutralized. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair away from the table. I smoothed the crisp emerald fabric of my gown, ensuring my posture reflected the unyielding strength I had forged in the fires of their betrayal. I picked up my evening bag, leaving the thick, red forensic binder resting next to the weeping head pastor. He would need those documents to rebuild his congregation long after I departed. I turned my back on the stage and walked purposefully down the center aisle. My heels clicked a steady, rhythmic tempo against the floorboards, parting the sea of whispering socialites. My trajectory brought me directly past the cocktail table where my soon-to-be ex-husband stood, rooted to the spot. Nathan looked up from his useless, dead smartphone. His face was a portrait of profound, cowardly ruin. The arrogant smirk he had worn when he departed for his golf weekend was entirely erased. His eyes were wide-pooling with desperate, panicked tears as he realized the sheer magnitude of the trap I had orchestrated. He reached a trembling hand out toward me, his fingers brushing the cool silk of my sleeve. "Catherine," he choked out, his voice a frail, pathetic whisper, begging for the very salvation he had previously mocked. "Please, you have to help me. I have nothing left." I paused my forward momentum, but I did not turn my body to face him. I simply looked at him over my shoulder, my gaze entirely devoid of pity, sorrow, or lingering affection. I saw a man who had demanded I pay an extortionate hourly rate to exist within his family, a man who valued my career solely as a mechanism to fund his cowardice. "My risk management consulting rate is $1,000 an hour, Nathan," I stated, my voice carrying a cool, carrying clarity that severed the final tether between us. "And your accounts are currently displaying insufficient funds." I broke his tenuous grip on my sleeve and continued walking toward the heavy mahogany exit doors. I stepped out of the suffocating banquet hall and into the crisp, refreshing coastal night air. Behind me, the fraudulent empire burned to the ground, fueled by their own insatiable greed, while I stepped into a future entirely constructed on my own uncompromising terms. The wheels of the federal justice system do not grind with dramatic flair. They operate with a cold, relentless, mechanical certainty. In the weeks following the gala, the illusion of the Greenwich elite evaporated into a sterile stack of grand jury indictments. Philip and Diana discovered that country club charm holds zero currency inside a federal courtroom. The prosecution did not need to negotiate or offer lenient plea deals. The red forensic binder I had delivered to the head pastor provided an airtight roadmap of their embezzlement. The routing logs, the shell company registrations, and the signed mediation documents formed a perfect, undeniable chain of custody. The presiding judge, a man entirely unimpressed by their aristocratic posturing, denied their initial requests for bail, citing the severe flight risk posed by their hidden offshore accounts. The ensuing trial was swift and unmerciful. Philip and Diana were convicted on multiple counts of severe wire fraud, tax evasion, and criminal conspiracy. They were sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The sprawling coastal estate they had utilized to project their manufactured supremacy was seized under federal forfeiture laws. I watched from a safe distance as government contractors changed the heavy brass locks and hauled away their imported Italian furniture. The property was sold at a public government auction, the proceeds diverted to pay restitution to the church building fund they had so callously drained. My former in-laws traded their designer silk and tailored wool for standard-issue uniform jumpsuits, their legacy permanently erased from the Connecticut shoreline. Nathan inherited the exact future he had cowardishly engineered. Stripped of his parents' illicit capital, his boutique investment firm collapsed within 30 days. The corporate facade shattered, revealing a hollow operation entirely dependent on laundered cash. Because he had willingly executed that unauthorized $5,000 wire transfer from my isolated salary reserve, the Internal Revenue Service categorized him as a complicit operative in the laundering syndicate. He avoided federal prison by serving as a cooperating witness against his own parents, but the civil penalties were ruinous. The government levied staggering fines against him, leaving him functionally destitute and devoid of any professional credibility. Without a single dollar to his name and carrying the radioactive stigma of a highly publicized financial scandal, Nathan was permanently blacklisted from the entire financial sector. The man who had proudly defended an extortionate babysitting rate now spends his days wearing a stiff polyester uniform, working a grueling minimum wage job at a regional hardware store. He stocks heavy inventory on metal shelves and sweeps concrete aisles to slowly pay off a mountain of civil litigation debt. He traded a supportive wife and a secure household for the fleeting approval of criminals, and he reaped the precise mathematical outcome of that calculation. He has no social standing, no country club memberships, and no trust fund waiting to save him. The dissolution of our marriage mirrored the swift efficiency of a corporate merger cancellation. I filed for divorce the very morning after the church gala. Nathan possessed no capital to hire a defense attorney and no standing to request alimony. The signed mediation packet from the Hartford conference room legally bound him to his own destitution while insulating me from the resulting fallout. The family court judge granted my petition for a full, uncontested divorce in record time. I retained sole physical and legal custody of our son, ensuring the boy would grow up entirely shielded from the toxic entitlement that had poisoned his father's bloodline. The legal firewall around my child is now impenetrable, blocking any future attempts at contact from a disgraced family. Hannah experienced a profound and deeply satisfying restoration. The church board, horrified by the sheer scale of the embezzlement and desperate to salvage their public standing, terminated the remaining corrupt committee members. They formally apologized to Hannah, issuing a substantial financial settlement for her wrongful termination to avoid a drawn-out defamation lawsuit. She was fully reinstated, not just as a charity treasurer, but promoted to the overarching financial director of the entire congregation. She now controls the ledgers with uncompromising transparency, ensuring a theft of that magnitude can never occur again. We still meet for coffee occasionally, sharing a quiet, knowing smile over the fact that a simple nanny and a risk actuary successfully brought down a corrupt dynasty. My own professional trajectory accelerated with breathtaking momentum. The managing directors at my Hartford insurance firm reviewed the comprehensive risk analysis I had executed to protect the holding bank from Diana fraudulent trust fund. They recognized that my ability to isolate and neutralize a multi-million-dollar liability while simultaneously navigating a high-stakes domestic crisis was an unparalleled asset. They did not just retain my position, they cleared the executive tier, promoting me to the newly created role of Executive Director of Risk Assessment. I now command a sprawling corner office with floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the bustling city center, dictating policy for international underwriters, and commanding a compensation package that dwarfs the fake wealth my in-laws used to flaunt. I utilized a fraction of my performance bonuses to purchase a beautiful, secure, contemporary home nestled on a quiet stretch of the Connecticut coast. The property features towering windows framing the Long Island Sound and a state-of-the-art security system that ensures our peace remains entirely undisturbed. The architecture is clean, the air is fresh, and the environment is entirely free of the suffocating judgment I endured during my marriage. There are no surprise visits. There are no manipulative invoices slid across granite countertops. There is only the calm, steady rhythm of a life built on an unyielding foundation of truth. My son plays in a sunlit nursery, surrounded by genuine affection and steady, unwavering protection. He will never learn to equate love with financial transactions. I am standing right now in my executive office, watching the morning traffic weave through the financial district below. The sun reflects off the glass towers, casting brilliant beams of light across my polished mahogany desk. The journey from that initial extortionate babysitting demand to this pinnacle of professional and personal triumph reinforced a singular, immutable law of human behavior. Toxic relatives rely exclusively on the illusion of familial obligation to mask their parasitism. They weaponize guilt and societal expectations to extract your resources, demanding you subsidize their delusions while they systematically attempt to diminish your worth. They expect you to shrink. They expect you to write the check, keep the peace, and swallow your pride just to maintain a fragile social equilibrium. But loyalty is a currency that must be earned, not a blank check issued by the coincidence of biology. When people demand you pay a premium for their mere presence, you must stop treating them like family. You must analyze them like a hostile corporate entity. You audit their reality. You locate the fragile fault lines in their manufactured superiority. You strip their power piece by piece until they are left standing in the undeniable wreckage of their own making. I did not let my in-laws tear my career apart over a petty grievance. I turned their greed into a glaring spotlight, illuminating the dark, hollow core of their entire existence. I am Catherine Schmidt, and I calculate the exact cost of a disaster for a living. They severely underestimated the price of crossing me, and they will spend the rest of their natural lives paying the invoice I generated. Thank you for listening to my story. Never apologize for protecting your boundaries, and always remember that the most devastating weapon against a narcissist is the unvarnished, irrefutable truth. We are raised on a very specific, deeply ingrained American myth. It is the picturesque portrait of the multi-generational family gathered around a polished dining table, passing down wisdom, wealth, and unconditional support. We are instructed from a young age that grandparents are the vital, untouchable anchors of a child's moral development, the revered elders who provide a safety net when the modern world becomes too demanding. But what happens when the anchor is tied to a sinking, rotting ship? When my former mother-in-law slid an itemized invoice across her pristine granite counter, demanding an hourly rate to spend a single afternoon with her own grandson, she did not just present a bill. She presented a terrifying indictment of her own hollow soul. It was a glaring, unforgiving spotlight on the catastrophic failure of her parenting, and a stark warning about the future she intended to map out for my child. In our culture, we frequently confuse accumulation with affection. We equate trust funds, coastal estates, and elite private schools with successful child rearing. Philip and Diana constructed a $250,000 educational trust for my son, projecting the illusion of benevolent, forward-thinking patriarchs and matriarchs. Yet their underlying intent was to use his pristine, innocent legal identity as a tax haven for their illicit activities. This is the dark underbelly of the American dream gone awry. True family responsibility does not lie in securing a tax-advantaged lineage or ensuring your descendants can afford yacht club dues. It requires the hard, unglamorous work of instilling honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness. When parents replace moral guidance with financial manipulation, they do not raise children, they cultivate accomplices. They teach their offspring that every human interaction is a transaction, a ledger where affection is bought and loyalty is leased. Look at the man I once called my husband. Nathan was the tragic, inevitable byproduct of a home devoid of emotional integrity. When a child is raised in an environment where love is conditional and public image supersedes truth, they learn to survive through cowardice. Nathan watched his parents extort his wife, and his immediate instinct was to capitulate, to pay the ransom, to smooth over the friction at the expense of his own household's security. He stole from my isolated salary reserve not out of spontaneous spite, but out of a deeply conditioned, paralyzing fear of losing his inheritance. This is the ultimate failure of traditional parenting devoid of a moral compass. You create adults who possess the sophisticated vocabulary of success but lack the fundamental spine to stand up for what is right. They become parasitic echoes of their parents' worst traits, entirely incapable of protecting the families they eventually create. As a mother, my supreme duty extends far beyond providing shelter and sustenance. I am the primary architect of my son's reality. I must build an environment where fairness is the baseline, where honesty is not a strategic option, but an unyielding requirement. The moment I realized my in-laws were utilizing my child as a pawn in their embezzlement syndicate, the traditional concept of keeping the family together became a toxic, dangerous fallacy. Society conditions mothers to be the perpetual peacemakers. We are pressured to swallow our pride and endure infinite disrespect for the sake of the holiday photos and the extended family dynamic. We are taught that a broken home is a tragedy to be avoided at all costs. But I learned through the cold lens of risk assessment that the true tragedy is an intact home built over a foundation of lies. Staying silent to preserve a traditional structure only teaches a child that abuse is acceptable as long as it is packaged in a familiar, wealthy disguise. Long-term guidance for children in today's rapid-paced world demands emotional transparency. We must show them that actions carry profound consequences regardless of a person's social standing or bank account balance. By dismantling the corrupt empire my in-laws had built, and by legally excising Nathan from our lives, I provided my son with the most crucial lesson he will ever receive. I demonstrated that integrity is non-negotiable. I showed him that no amount of money or familial pressure can purchase our dignity. We now live in a quiet, sunlit home on the coast, free from the suffocating judgment and the transactional affection of the Greenwich elite. He plays in a space where love is freely given, never invoiced. He will grow up understanding that respect must be earned through honorable actions, not demanded through a shared last name. The stories we share, the hidden conflicts we navigate behind closed doors, are rarely isolated incidents. They are reflections of a broader cultural struggle to redefine what family truly means in a society that often prioritizes appearance over substance. If you have ever recognized the hollow echo of conditional love in your own lineage, if you have ever had to make the agonizing choice to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace and your children's future, you are not alone. Please subscribe to Sarah Told Stories and join our growing community. We explore the profound, often painful realities of reclaiming our lives from those who seek to diminish us, shining a light on the narratives that society prefers to keep hidden in the shadows. We spend our lives terrified of the void, terrified of the silence that follows when we cut the cord on the people who raised us or the partners we chose. We stay at tables where respect is no longer served because we inherently fear the empty chairs. But consider this stark, uncomfortable truth. What if the highest form of family loyalty is leaving the family altogether? We are told that blood is sacred, an unbreakable bond demanding infinite forgiveness. I fundamentally reject this notion. Blood is merely a biological coincidence. It is a starting point, not a life sentence. What if the most profound legacy you can leave your child is the demonstrated courage to walk away from a corrupted inheritance? As you look at the people sitting around your own dinner table tonight, ask yourself if you are preserving a genuine bond or if you are simply paying the ongoing ransom for a comfortable illusion. The answer might cost you everything you thought you knew, but it is the only currency that actually buys your freedom.